Princess Diana sits in darkness, surrounded by stacks of tabloid newspapers. Tears stream down her face as she stares at the phone, contemplating who to call next. A royal aide has just informed her that her conversations with a lover have been recorded. The palace walls have ears. The people's princess is trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, worshipped by millions, yet utterly alone. What the public sees as a fairy tale marriage is, behind closed doors, a carefully orchestrated performance built on manipulation and betrayal. The woman canonized as a modern saint was, in reality, playing a dangerous game with the most powerful family in Britain. And they were playing one with her. The image you just saw is absent from the classroom version of the story. That neat textbook narrative, the tidy rise, the benevolent reign of public compassion, the martyrdom doesn't include late-night recordings, forged documents, or the private economy of grief. Now, let us recall the official version everyone learned, the comfortable, consoling myth that turned a messy life into a moral fable. In textbooks, Diana's origin reads like a painting. A shy, slender 19-year-old from an aristocratic but not wealthy family. A kindergarten teacher, laughing in sunlit rooms. A young woman who caught a prince's eye and was elevated almost overnight. The wedding was a coronation of innocence. The cameras loved her, the crowds adored her. That is the first frame of the official story, origin as fairy tale. The second frame is transformation. Diana became the people's princess. She modernized the monarchy without challenging it. She attended hospitals, put a human hand on AIDS patients, walked through minefields, and touched the images that media found irresistible. The public saw compassion in motion. The monarchy gained a new face, soft, modern, photographic. This version insists she was different from the cold, wooden institution. She softened it by being herself. In the third frame, failure becomes tragedy. The marriage to Charles collapses. The public is told a simple moral. Diana was betrayed. Charles loved another Camilla Parker Bowles. The wronged woman emerges. Her humanitarian work becomes heroic precisely because it is contrasted with private betrayal. She takes pain and turns it into purpose. The narrative closes with martyrdom, a sudden death in a Paris tunnel, flowers in the street, a grieving nation, an end that sanctifies the whole arc. These three frames, origin, transformation, tragedy, fit together beautifully. They make a story that is easy to tell and easier to feel. It is a story with heroes and villains placed where we expect them. It operates with moral clarity. And that is the point. Clarity sells. It calms. It comforts. You learned this version in classrooms and saw it on screens. You saw it in documentaries that edited their footage to tell this tidy arc. You watched films where every scene bends toward sympathy. The myth became a cultural shorthand. Diana equals goodness. The institution equals oppression. That shorthand is efficient. It collapses complexity into a single image. But efficiency often costs truth. Imagine a classroom montage, slides of Diana smiling, intercut with shots of hospital wards, then a slow dissolve to black on the news of her death. The montage is accompanied by a narrator voice that folds every contradiction into a lesson about the cruelty of power. The montage is soothing. It makes sense, but it also erases friction. Here are the confident voices of the myth, short and polished, the kind you would hear in a documentary voiceover or read in a commemorative booklet. She made the monarchy human, says a historian in an authoritative tone. Her compassion changed perceptions of royalty, intones a celebrity pundit on TV. She was the people's light in a dark institution, declares a best-selling biography. Each line is airtight. Each line is part of the official record. Those voices function like a chorus. They repeat the same moral beats until repetition becomes conviction. They do not invite messy questions. They do not linger over inconvenient details. And that silence is useful. Institutions and industries prefer stories that do not demand structural examination. A comfortable myth protects more than a person. It shields reputations and revenue streams. Who benefits from the polished story? Start with the media. A grieving public consumes grief. Photos of Diana in repose, images of crowds fainting, these became international commodities. Newspapers sold by the millions. Television ratings spiked. For broadcasters, Diana's life was content with near infinite shelf life. The more simplified the narrative, the easier it is to package. Safe stories produce predictable audiences, and advertisers love predictability. Tourism profited as well. Diana's image seeded travel narratives. Visit London, the stories said. See the palace where a saint once lived. Her smile became a magnet for itineraries and souvenir production. Museums curated her dresses. Shops sold commemorative plates. There was economic gravity around the image of a martyr, an entire sector that benefited from the continuation of the myth. Political actors found advantage, too. When Tony Blair called her the People's Princess, it was not only sincere condolence. It was political storytelling, a Labour government aligning itself with popular sympathy. That phrase folded emotional capital into political legitimacy. Governments learned. Association with a beloved figure can humanize policy and soften critiques. Humanitarians and NGOs were not exempt. Diana's causes, AIDS, landmines, received far greater attention and funding because she touched them. That is genuine good. Do not mistake critique of narrative convenience for denial of practical benefit. Her involvement mobilized resources. Yet the moral clarity of the myth often eclipsed the complexity of the causes. Media-friendly actions, photographic handshakes, staged visits channel attention, but can also flatten the politics behind an issue. Celebrities and the entertainment industry found a perfect archetype. Diana became a character in movies, series, and books. Her life, refashioned into tidy arcs, fit Hollywood's appetite for emotionally freighted narratives. Adaptation required simplification. Complexity is harder to sell to mass audiences. So the adaptations trimmed edges, smoothed contradictions, and foreground scenes that fit the archetypal narrative: innocence, victimhood, and sainthood. But simplicity raises a question. At what cost did we accept that comfort? When a story is that well crafted, it discourages curiosity. It makes critical questions seem like poor taste. Why dig when the narrative is consoling? Why prick the communal bubble of grief? The official story's power comes not only from what it tells, but from what it forbids, and forbidden questions are themselves a form of power. Now picture the official story as a museum exhibit. Glass cases, spotlights, curated captions. Viewers move through in silence, nodding at the artifacts. The curator's voice tells us what to feel. The exhibit is tasteful, it is expensive, and it is edited. But even the best edited exhibits contain shadow rooms, items left unlabeled, documents in storage, testimonies that never made the catalog. Those absences are telling. A myth is rarely an accident of storytelling. It is often constructed. Constructed myths have architects. They also have incentives. Think of the myth as a structure of mirrors. Each reflection reinforces the others. Biographies reference documentaries that reference newspaper coverage that references official statements. Over time, the reflections harden into consensus. The public begins to assume that consensus equals fact. Yet consensus can mask coordinated omissions and comfortable edits. If this version sounds tidy, that is because it was engineered to be. The official narrative tells a moral truth, a person who used her pain to help others, and that moral truth became a tool. It soothed national nerves, it fed industries, and it served political narratives. All of that is true and, at first glance, harmless. But the next sections will show that harmlessness had teeth. Omissions, staged moments, cultivated leaks, and private economies of influence that complicate the saintly portrait. You have seen this story in films and heard it in eulogies. It comforts, but you will soon see that it leaves critical fissures unexamined. What looks like simple victimhood is seamed with strategy and contradiction. And those Charles, in his 30s, was under pressure familial, social, dynastic to produce an appropriate match. Diana's family had lineage and connections. She was considered suitable. They met 13 times before the engagement. 13 meetings is not a slow-burning romance. It is a convening. There was haste and an economy of suitability. In interviews later, Diana used the word desperate. That single admission complicates the notion of spontaneous romantic destiny. Ask yourself, when two people meet under the weight of institution and expectation, how much of love is authentic feeling and how much is a social contract and performance? The official story prefers the fairy tale answer. The archive suggests negotiation. That negotiation is the first fissure. Next, consider the presence of a third party. The public narrative locates blame squarely with Camilla Parker Bowles. In that version, Charles loved Camilla. Diana was the innocent betrayed. But contemporaneous notes and private letters paint a messier picture. Charles's relationship with Camilla did not simply restart after marriage. It lingered, folded into decisions and gestures. Diana found a bracelet, a small but telling artifact with pet names engraved. She recognized a world of signals. She suspected. Yet the public story reframed her as surprised later, as a wronged innocence uncovering cuckoldry years after the fact. That dissonance is not a small detail. It changes motives and the shape of agency. Another fissure is psychological. Eyewitness accounts and Diana's own later confessions reveal long-term suffering. Bulimia, self-harm, and attempted suicide. Those are not merely private struggles. They are behavioral evidence of emotional turbulence predating media attention. The official narrative often frames these struggles as produced by the Crown's pressure. That is partly true, but the record indicates vulnerabilities that existed earlier before the full weight of royal life. Recognizing that does not blame the victim. It complicates the picture. A person who is already fragile will interact with institutional pressure differently than a person who is not fragile at all. The interplay between vulnerability and strategy is perhaps the most damning fissure. Diana was fragile in many ways. Yet she also demonstrated strategic acumen. She learned the mechanics of public attention early. She cultivated certain journalists. She shaped specific images. These are facts confirmed by multiple testimonies and by the patterns of coverage. Jenny Bond, among others, has remarked that Diana called journalists and nurtured relationships with reporters. That behavior challenges the simple, hounded victim narrative. She was hounded often brutally, but she was also an active participant in shaping how that hounding told her story. Imagine a scene in a flat after midnight. The phone rings. A reporter answers a carefully phrased confession. In another room, wardrobes hang, makeup sits on a vanity, and propped newspapers show the previous day's front pages. The production requires props. The myth erases the props and leaves only the tear. That erasure is deliberate. A related fissure concerns money and consumption. The official story likes to dwell on Diana's humanitarian wardrobe, the iconic dresses, the accessible style. The press adored the clothes because clothes sold copies. But the private accounts describe extravagant spending, clothes purchased at rates that outran even royal largesse. Vacations, private jets, staff, and secret getaways required funding and enabling. Those details complicate the morally pristine image. Generosity coexisted with consumption. The saintliness of charity appeared next to behaviors that suggested entitlement to luxury. The myth frames these as victim compensation. The record shows choices. Then there is the media relationship itself, the paradox at the heart of Diana's public life. She is often portrayed as relentlessly pursued by the press. That chase is real. Paparazzi chased, photographers prowled, and invasions were frequent. Yet Diana also turned press attention into performance. Arranged candid photos, timing school visits when cameras would be waiting, strategically leaked tidbits. The pattern has a dual character, predation and collaboration. To think of Diana as only prey is to miss how she weaponized attention. Consider the protection dynamic. In private correspondence and staff testimonies, Diana expressed paranoia plans to sweep rooms for bugs, phone calls, and code, the belief that palace security monitored her. In some cases, paranoia had substance. The palace did have a culture of surveillance. But Diana's response is sweeps, coded language function as counter-surveillance. They are acts of someone who knows she is under observation and attempts to reassert control. That kind of behavior is not mere hysteria. It is tactical. It signals an understanding. The royal body is porous. Trust is fragile. Another crack opens on how staff and allies functioned. Diana curated a network, a sister who screened lovers, a private secretary who helped craft narratives, friends who offered discreet hideaways. These people were not merely companions. They were operatives in an image management apparatus. Those who were useful were rewarded. Those who crossed her were pushed away. Ken Worf, a former protection officer, recounts episodes where emotional manipulation was used to secure loyalty. That manipulative capacity complicates the saintly image. It shows a pattern, use of emotion as leverage. Let us speak of lovers. The romantic life we saw on screens was complicated by affairs that, in private, seemed to follow a pattern. Intense embrace, then disposal. James Hewitt's long affair, conducted while Diana still publicly portrayed herself as a wronged wife, has become a headline shorthand. But the pattern is revealing for another reason. Romantic partners served emotional needs and strategic purposes. They were sources of intimacy, yes, but they were also symbols, proofs of desirability, channels for revenge, or stages to reclaim agency. The strategic use of family and children is a particularly painful fissure. Diana often presented maternal moments to the press, walking with her sons, caught in gentle domestic frames. Those moments were genuine. She loved her children. But mothers became public assets in a relational war. Diana timed school visits when lenses were ready. She staged moments to claim the moral high ground. That meant Prince William and Prince Harry, even as teens, were drawn into public calculations. Roles reversed. Sons became emotional confidants and strategic props. The moral complexity here is heavy. A mother using maternal performance to win public sympathy raises questions about boundaries and consent, especially when the children are not fully able to opt in. The palace itself was an ecosystem of surveillance and counter-surveillance. Each royal installed loyal employees to track the other. Rooms were swept. Phones were monitored. The institution employed a low, grinding hum of observation. That environment fueled distrust. The perception of being watched drove some of Diana's more paranoid moves, which in turn fueled more surveillance, a feedback loop. This is not mere melodrama. It is political theater in miniature, two actors using their staff as stagehands and spies. Critically, these fissures suggest not a monster and not a saint, but someone complexly human, intelligent, vulnerable, performative, strategic, and deeply wounded. That complexity makes the saintly story inadequate. It also means the simplistic villainization of the palace is insufficient. Both actor and institution used media, loyalty, and secrecy as weapons. As contradictions piled up, small scandals accumulated into a larger narrative of distrust. The public saw a series of flashes, interviews, leaks, and eventually the panorama broadcast. But those flashes were not spontaneous combustions. They were the result of months, even years, of cultivation. Diana learned the mechanics of publicity and used them. At the same time, palace aides cultivated their own counters, rehabilitative press, controlled leaks, and private briefings for sympathetic journalists. A war of narrative control unfolded with press releases, late-night conversations, and, at times, forgery. And then there is the disorienting paradox of victimhood and agency. Diana was undeniably a victim in many ways of expectations, of intrusion, of a collapse. In those corridors, the marriage did not simply fail. It became a campaign, an escalating struggle fought by leaks, by carefully timed appearances, and by alliances that read like a map of favors and debts. Picture a late winter evening in Kensington. Low light, a dressing table, a telephone left off the hook. Diana sits with a silk robe around her shoulders. The room smells of perfume and cheap coffee. There are stacks of newspapers on the bed, annotated with penciled notes. She flips through the clippings not as a shocked woman discovering headlines, but as a director checking stills. Which photo runs tomorrow? Which line hits the heart? The question is tactical, not merely existential. Her network looks ordinary at first glance: sisters, secretaries, friends, protection officers. But these relationships function like an apparatus. Lady Sarah McCorkadale, her sister, is not merely kin. She screens lovers, sets up discreet introductions, and, when necessary, filters bad information. Patrick Jeffson, the private secretary, keeps calendars, drafts letters, and chooses which confidences to pass along. Trusted journalists received late-night calls. A grief-laden confession delivered in the middle of the night. A rumor carefully fed with a fact or two to anchor it. Richard Kay and other reliable reporters sat on those crumbs, spinning them into headlines. Scenes repeat. An aide arranges a photograph: Diana at a school gate, bareheaded, hand on a child's shoulder. The photographer gets the shot that evening. The paper runs the next morning with a spread designed to make the nation exhale. At the same time, an envelope is slid under the palace door, a scathing note about Charles. Someone in a press office calls a sympathetic columnist. The leaks and the performances cross-fertilize. The narrative grows like ivy, covering the bare stone. Those who served the narrative were rewarded. Those who resisted were quietly removed. Former protection officer Ken Worf tells of a pattern. Loyalty bought by being made the keeper of secrets, then rewarded with proximity. When loyalty flagged, people were phased out, transferred to distant posts, eased from the inner circle. Diana mastered a kind of emotional bookkeeping. Tearful confessions bought loyalty. Public praise purchased fealty. But the machine worked two ways. Palace aides on Charles's side, and in the wider institution, built their own counterweights. They cultivated friendly journalists, styled rehabilitative pieces for the prince, and orchestrated quiet briefings that softened criticism. The palace was not a single mind. It was a nervous system reacting to stimuli. Each leak was a stimulus. Each staged photograph a counter-stimulus. The press became an arena in which both sides performed and probed. The public, the jury. Diana's paranoia about surveillance was visceral. She would sweep rooms for bugs, hire teams to check wiring, and insist on code words for conversations. The detail is telling. She did not simply suspect because she was afraid. She suspected because she understood that information could be turned into power. Paranoia, in her case, functioned as a survival tactic. It produced secrecy rituals, coded phone calls, rendezvous in anonymous hotels, a language of hints and omissions. Those rituals were not merely defensive. They were active measures to control narrative channels. Intimacy, too, operated as currency. Lovers were not only lovers. They were confidants, proofs of desirability, instruments of revenge, and sometimes scapegoats. James Hewitt, the cavalry officer, occupies a particular place in this tapestry. Warmth in the night, intensity on the phone, and then the slow unraveling as headlines metastasized. His presence served emotional and solace, validation and political ones, evidence that Diana was not to be written off as helpless. The pattern repeats with other partners, each episode both intimate and theatrical. Children became part of the playbook. Diana's maternal gestures walking with her sons across a lawn, smiling at school gates were often arranged for visibility. The tableau is simple and powerful, a royal mother, exposed and human. The truth is not a single lie. It is the coexistence of genuine affection and instrumental performance. William and Harry received affection, but they were also, at times, props in a larger contest for sympathy. A photograph of a mother leading a son by the hand could neutralize a damaging story. A school run could be timed to reclaim narrative sympathy. Inside the palace, a slow war of surveillance and counter-surveillance consumed energy and trust. Each household installed loyal staff to watch the other. Rooms were swept. Phones tapped, sometimes legally, sometimes ambiguously. The culture of monitoring produced more monitoring. One gesture of suspicion prompted another, and soon the institution became a panopticon where everyone suspected they were seen. These backstage arrangements produced behaviors that complicate the simple victim narrative. Diana wielded emotion as influence. She cultivated allies who would turn compassion into headlines. She punished those who crossed her by withdrawing access, by creating reputational costs. And she rewarded obedience by making people the custodians of intimate truths. The result was an ecosystem where love, fear, loyalty, and strategy intermingled until they were indistinguishable. So what did this all leave in its wake? A woman who used every lever: friends, staff, lovers, children, photographers to hold sway over an audience. A palace that responded with its own levers: briefings, leaks, curated images to contain the damage. A press corps that learned to read the signals and monetize them. And in the middle of that map, a person whose pain was both authentic and, at times, instrumental. There is one more thing to understand. Systems like this rarely remain stable. The more the apparatus operates, the more brittle it becomes. Small deceptions compound, confidences erode, alliances fracture. Behind the staged photographs and midnight calls, fault lines deepen. And fault lines, left unattended, break. What happens when the fault finally opens? What happens when a public confession television, unavoidable, intimate arrives not as an honest reckoning, but as a culmination of months of calculated moves? The answer is the single night that changed everything: a broadcast that looked like a truth, but behind it, a forgery and a campaign. The story is about to turn. November 20th, 1995. A date that functions like a seam pulled from a garment. The whole thing unravels. At 9 p.m. In living rooms across Britain and beyond, viewers settle into sofas expecting a candid television piece. Princess Diana appears composed, wearing a simple dark suit, hair arranged, eyes practiced to look both steady and vulnerable. Martin Bashir's calm voice opens the door. The nation leans in. The interview itself reads like a confession, intimate, raw, damning. Diana speaks with a clarity that shocks. The phrase that lodged in public memory, "There were 3 people in this marriage," cuts through myth like a knife. She confirms infidelity, questions Charles's fitness, and implies institutional complicity. That night, 23 million Britons watched a monarchy fracture on live television. What the frame hides, however, is a darkly elaborate prehistory that transforms the broadcast from revelation into operation. Bashir did not simply win access by charm. Investigations and testimony later revealed he used deception: false documents, forged bank statements presented to Diana's brother, insinuations about paid surveillance to play into Diana's anxieties. He exploited mistrust like a match in dry tinder. Imagine the sequence as a set of interlocking moves. First, an information leak suggested palace staff were being paid to spy on Diana, proof, apparently, that those around her were traitors. The source? A document later shown to be forged. The target? Diana's deepest fear, that she was not only isolated but actively undermined. Next, Bashir positioned himself as the ally who could expose the conspiracy. He offered a platform. Then, Diana, primed by years of suspicion and seeking a way to break free of imposed narratives, agreed to speak. This was not a spontaneous catharsis. Diana rehearsed answers. Makeup was chosen to enhance vulnerability under studio lights. The words were sincere. She moved into a liminal space, no longer entirely within the palace's protective umbrella, yet remaining a magnet for the press and for adoring crowds. Practical consequences: who drove her, which cars she used, how her movements were supervised shifted dramatically. This alteration mattered in a literal sense. Within 2 years, in the small hours of a Parisian morning, a driver's decision, speed, route, manner intersected with a paparazzi chase and precious weak protection. The technical changes that followed the interview were not abstract. They reconfigured the conditions of her vulnerability. The interview did not kill Diana, but it changed the calculus around her safety in ways that made disaster more likely. Beyond logistics, the interview revealed a deeper truth about motive and value. Diana had come to understand that her greatest leverage in the conflict with the monarchy was her authenticity as presented to the public. Tears, confessions, and visible pain had political heft. She could use them to delegitimize a centuries-old institution that prized reserve. The palace recognized this, and the institution reacted as any adaptive power does, by seeking to neutralize, to control, to contain. But what this sequence also exposes is moral ambiguity. Diana was, undeniably, telling real stories of betrayal and pain. The fact that some of the scaffolding around those stories was manufactured does not negate their emotional reality. Yet, the presence of manipulation complicates heroism. It complicates villainy, and it complicates our memory. The interview thus becomes the hinge, a consummation of strategies, fears, and ethical compromises. It made Diana more powerful in the public sphere and more precarious in the practical one. It stripped away institutional protections and rerouted the channels of power. Emotional sway replaced formal authority. Then there is the aftershock of reputation. The palace moved to reclaim narrative ground. Documented campaigns softened the image of Charles. Controlled leaks, strategic appearances, and the slow drip of rehabilitative coverage began the work of myth repair. The court, ancient and practiced in the arts of symbolism and ceremony, recognized that winning back public trust required an orchestrated aesthetic, public contrition, displays of family unity, the careful staging of continuity. And yet the core dissonance remained. How does an institution square the public's demand for authenticity with its own need for discretion? The interview forced that question into daylight. It exposed a paradox. Performative authenticity could topple centuries of cultivated mystique. Institutions learned an ugly lesson: emotional truth could displace ceremonial truth. What comes next is a predictable and dangerous pattern. When someone becomes too useful to the public and too unpredictable to the institution, formal protections are loosened, informal threats proliferate. The interview had achieved its tactical aim. It remade Diana into a symbolic force. But in doing so, it made her a liability to those whose authority rested on stability. The stage was set for responses not always visible in public records, responses that would harden into conspiracy in some corners and into bitter fact in others. The question that now insists itself: when truth is weaponized and weaponized truth is true and false at once, who is responsible for the harm that follows? The machinery that manufactured the access, the instincts that consented to it, or the institution that recoiled? The answer matters, because the reverberations of that night did not end with televised ratings. They altered the shape of protection, publicity, grief, and, ultimately, history. But if that interview changed immediate circumstances, what made it possible in the first place? Who fed the forgeries? Who calculated the payoff? And who, in the end, had the most everything to gain from turning a private breakdown into a public spectacle? The full ledger of culpability opens into a ledger of influence, a machine that will be the subject of the next act. The myth of Diana did not congeal in a vacuum. It was built, polished, and sold by technicians of influence. The moment of death sealed the martyr image, but the work of making that image usable, profitable, political, mythic was ongoing long before Paris and continued after the flowers wilted. To understand the endurance of the Diana legend, we must watch the machinery of propaganda in motion. The editors, the publicists, the politicians, the promoters, each playing their role in a theater of remembrance. Begin with the obvious: a princess who invited photographs, who chose clothes for impact, who walked into hospitals with cameras waiting, left a media industry with a goldmine. Tabloid editors learned early: Diana content sells. Circulation rose. Front pages brightened with global sales. Photographs of a touched Diana holding a hand, placing a bandage, smiling at a child became repeatable assets. They were cropped, captioned, and recycled. They paid salaries and dividends. For newspapers and broadcasters, the moral clarity of the saintly narrative was convertible directly into cash. Mohammed al-Fayed, whose son died in the crash, turned mourning into a crusade of suspicion. He promoted conspiracy theories alleging institutional malfeasance. These claims found a receptive market in a public already primed to suspect power. Whether one believes the conspiracy or not, the effect is measurable. Alternative narratives multiplied, keeping Diana in the news cycle and stimulating a grief economy. Memorials, souvenirs, exhibitions of dresses, books, documentaries each became nodes in a network that turned memory into merchandise. The grief industry around Diana is an economy. Souvenirs sold in millions, markets for images sustained for decades. Political operatives, too, recognize the symbolic utility. Ask any spin doctor why Tony Blair's People's Princess line was delivered in the exact tone it was, and they will tell you it was not an accident. Alastair Campbell and the New Labour team used Diana's popularity to associate a government with compassion and modernity. The phrase stitched emotional capital to political legitimacy. The state learned to borrow warmth. The exchange rate favored those who understood the currency. Hollywood, never slow to monetize a cultural archetype, repurposed Diana as an archetypal figure, the tragic innocent resisting cold power. Films and series reduced complex lives into narrative arcs optimized for melodrama. The choices that work on screen, clear villains, sympathetic victims, tidy moral lessons, weren't selected for nuance. Netflix's dramatizations reached audiences in the tens of millions, reinforcing frames that privileged pathos over complexity. Each retelling further smoothed edges and occluded complications. Social media performs the same alchemy at scale. Algorithms reward emotional extremes. Simplified stories spread faster than nuance. The model is predictable. A heart-tugging image of Diana is reposted, commented on, rectified, and relicensed. Each platform's architecture privileges narrative simplicity. The result is a steady recirculation of the saint versus system trope. People like stories that make their outrage feel moral. But the propaganda apparatus also works subtler, through curricula, exhibitions, and the architecture of commemoration. Museums curate dresses with captions that invite reverence. School lessons condense complex lives into tidy moral exemplars. Tourism agencies sell a London stop on the Diana route. Each institutional endorsement canonizes part of the image. Over time, repetition polishes doubt. Dissent seems like desecration. What interests motivated these choices? Sometimes money, sometimes power, sometimes both. Media companies increased revenues. Politicians gained moral warmth. Merchandisers profited. NGOs and charities gained publicity and funding. Even activists occasionally found useful rhetorical leverage. Diana as emblem of compassion that legitimized broader causes. Each actor had a rational incentive to keep the simplified story alive. At the level of method, the machine used a set of repeatable tools: selection, amplification, omission. Selection chooses which moments to highlight: her charity visits, her vulnerabilities, her wardrobe. Amplification repeats and magnifies those moments until they are iconic. Omission erases inconvenient facts. It normalized the confessional activist, the celebrity who mobilizes attention to causes through personal narrative. From Angelina Jolie to modern social media influencers, the blueprint is similar. Bind a cause to personal story, attach visuals, drive attention. The outcome can be positive funds, awareness, policy change, but it also collapses complex political issues into individual narratives. And there is an ethical sediment that accumulates. The more a life is turned into symbol, the more its human complexity is flattened. People begin to expect simplicity from public figures, either saint or sinner, no messy human in between. That binary is useful to storytellers because it sells. It is corrosive to historical understanding because it forgives omissions in service of feeling. The propaganda machine also creates secondary myths about the institution as villain or about the omnipotence of the press. Each secondary myth serves actors with distinct motives. Some activists weaponize Diana as proof of systemic failure. Some commentators wield her story to argue against institutions broadly. The problem is not that these arguments are always false. The problem is that they are rarely the whole truth. Partial truths become whole stories in a culture that prizes coherence. Finally, the machine's most dangerous power is its ability to naturalize myths. Repetition over decades makes stories feel like origins. Young people who never lived through the 1990s absorb a version of Diana as a parable. The original fissures, the forged documents, the strategic leaked calls all recede. The simplified image hardens into cultural DNA. If you step back, the picture is stark. A life complicated, fragile, strategic, and sincere in parts was made into a product that served many ends. That product changed the monarchy, remade political rhetoric, reshaped charity, and taught institutions to perform emotion. It also taught the public an easier way to make moral judgments. Choose a victim, choose an institution as villain, retell the story until it feels inevitable. So what remains? Not the full person, which was messy and contradictory, but a symbol that fits into arguments and sells in markets. That symbol is powerful, and power is self-perpetuating. Each time she is used to prove a point, that use reinforces the symbol. There is one final observation. Propaganda does not only work forward, it works backward. Once a life is canonized in simplified form, those who benefit from the new mythology will resist any attempt to show the cracks. They will point to good works, to global mourning, to charitable outcomes, truths that are real, and declare the mythology settled. That resistance explains why, decades on, certain lines of inquiry are still contested, why forgeries require inquiry, and why the tidy narrative persists. The next segment will try to assemble a more honest portrait, one that refuses simple labels without excusing harm. But before that, if a life can be harnessed so effectively, what does that say about the rest of what we are taught to revere, to hate, or to mourn? The machine that made Diana a saint is the same pattern that makes other myths. And that, finally, is the point we must hold in our heads as we turn the page. She is not a character from a sermon, nor a villain from a pamphlet. The more honest portrait of Diana is a film of overlapping exposures, moments shot through glass, moments intentionally staged, negatives deliberately burned. Start with the image most people prefer, the shy 19-year-old swept into a glittering institution, and then pull back the camera until you see the operator, the rigging, the assistants whispering cues. That view is necessary because it explains how a private woman came to speak public truths with such force. She learned performance as a survival skill. Diana's emotional life was not a costume she put on for cameras. The eating disorder, the cutting, the near-constant anxiety had texture and history. They traced back to childhood humiliations, to a family lineage of brittle pride and private collapses. In the quiet of a nursery at night, A small girl learned to translate feeling into reaction, a tremor, a laugh, a pleading look, and those reactions became shorthand for others. Years later, in palace corridors and hospital wards, the same shorthand registered as authenticity. That authenticity was real. It was also, in practiced hands, instrumentally useful. She had, simultaneously, an instinct for strategic storytelling. Where others saw vulnerability, she saw leverage. When she chose to walk into an AIDS ward or to put on a simple dress at an official event, she understood the drama those small choices would create. She knew how images would read on the printed page, on the evening news, and still slid into magazine spreads. This was partly temperament, a sharpness of social intelligence, and partly hard training at the hands of aides who taught her how to shape light, timing, and exit routes. The line between sincerity and stagecraft blurs here, because she did both with equal conviction. Her marriages of intimacy were exercises in the management of risk. Lovers were not merely lovers. They were conduits for affection, validation, and occasionally, distraction. The patterns are now familiar: rapid attachment, intense devotion, and then replacement or dismissal once the role had been played. James Hewitt, for example, is not merely a scandal in a headline. He is evidence of the repeated way Diana sought both protection and identity in relationships that could never fully contain her. That pattern speaks to need, not to calculated malice. It speaks to someone trying repeatedly to repair something internal with external solutions. Credit must be given where it is due. The humanitarian gestures were frequently authentic. When she took a child by the hand in a crowded hospital, you can feel the warmth in the photograph. The patient's face relaxes, and she appears not to be performing so much as to be present. Those instances mattered outside of image economies. Her minefield visits helped push an international treaty forward. Her advocacy on AIDS humanized people whom public discourse had demonized. These were not merely props. Policy and compassion sometimes moved because she was willing to put herself where official distance had preferred not to tread. At the same time, she could weaponize compassion. She discovered early that the camera loves a hand holding a child, a smile at a nurse, a tear at a bedside. She cultivated moments, the precise choreography of arrival, the soft lighting, the carefully timed smiles that would be replayed and recycled until meaning accreted. That does not make those gestures false. It makes them simultaneously human and tactical, genuine feelings articulated into public performance with acute awareness of the payoff. Her relations with staff and confidants reveal less flattering but equally human patterns. People who enhanced her story were rewarded. Those who questioned or restrained her were marginalized. There are records, letters, recollections, quiet resignations that show this pattern repeated enough to be called a method. It is the same logic, on a smaller scale, that drives political offices and corporate boards. Loyalty traded for access, silence bought with affection. In a palace where hierarchy and discretion are currencies, Diana found her own market and began to trade in it. Truth became elastic in her hands because the personal survival instincts that shaped her youth met an environment that rewarded spectacle. She could tell one version of a night to a lover, another to a secretary, and yet another to a journalist. When contradictions were exposed, the role of the wounded woman often served to blunt criticism. Tears were, in practice, a closing argument. That tactic did not invent her suffering. It used it. The moral friction here is stubborn. There is harm in exploiting sympathy, even when the sympathy springs from genuine pain. What then of responsibility? She bears some. For manipulations that hurt staff, for strategic leaks that escalated palace warfare, for the ways private emotional bargaining sometimes turned others into collateral. But responsibility is not the whole story. The institution she opposed had its own strategies for containment and control. When a powerful system faces someone who commands public affection and disregards its rules, the system retaliates by withdrawal of resources, by legal and social marginalization, and by reassigning protective functions. The removal of formal security after 1995 is not merely administrative. Seeing Diana as a complex agent does not absolve all harms she may have caused. It does not diminish the real affection millions felt for her. But it does demand that we stop demanding impossible purity from public figures and start recognizing the corrosive conditions that turn private pain into public theater. The next question, and it is a sharp one, is how a culture that profits from dramatized vulnerability chooses which vulnerabilities to protect and which to expose. And when you consider that, the frame tightens. There are people who learned how to use her, and people who learned how to profit from her image. The ledger is still open. Her death is the headline that refuses to stay in the past, but her afterlife is a machinery that never powers down. Walk into a souvenir stall in any global capital and you will see her face on postcards, on trinkets, on tributes printed in glossy happiness. Those objects are not neutral, they are currency. They tell a story about what was saved and what was edited out. To understand Diana's hidden legacy, you must follow that money and those narratives to where they alter institutions and habits of thought. First, the monarchy changed its choreography. The Queen's famously delayed televised remarks on the day of Diana's death taught the family an expensive lesson about mediated emotion. Visibility of feeling now mattered as much as ritual correctness. Palaces adapted. Ceremonial gestures were reworked to include a performative grief that reads well on screens. This was a cultural engineering response. It did not heal underlying tensions within the institution. It reprogrammed its public interface. The palace discovered that in the televisual era, ceremony must accommodate catharsis, not only tradition. Second, the politics of identification were remade. Tony Blair's People's Princess line was not a spontaneous elegy. It was a crafted tool. It linked a government to sympathy and thereby to legitimacy. Political operators learned that associating with a beloved figure could translate into electoral credibility. This is not trivial. It shifted how politicians deploy emotional narratives. A measured grief here, a performative remorse there, all calibrated to achieve specific policy or polling ends. Diana's memory became a political shortcut, a prepackaged warmth on demand. Third, the template of celebrity activism, deeply personal, theatrically intimate, and media first took firmer hold. Diana taught public figures that personal pain is an accelerant for causes. An image of tenderness on a hospital bed can mobilize donors faster than a policy paper. The consequences are mixed. On the positive side, celebrity spotlight can funnel millions into orphaned issues. On the negative side, it flattens structural analysis. A $1 million campaign for one child makes headlines. Systemic policy failures remain unaddressed. The style she pioneered elevated attention but risked simplifying solutions. The media business model learned a crucial lesson too. Emotions sell. Editors built entire news cycles around recurring narratives of victim versus institution. Algorithms later optimized this. Posts that sparked outrage or moved hearts were amplified, driving engagement and ads. Over time, society's appetite for raw, singular narratives hardened into expectation. You got used to stories with clear victims and villains because they were easiest to package and most profitable. That pattern accelerated the cultural hunger for simplified tragedies and moral certainties. Diana's impact also cascaded into family dynamics within the monarchy. Her sons inherited not only a title, but a template for public vulnerability. William and Harry's candid recounting of grief and trauma is part legacy, part strategy. It authenticates them in a media environment that values confession. But it also traps them. Their personal narratives serve both therapeutic functions and public relations ends. That double use shapes decision-making, what to reveal, when to withdraw, how to frame private pain as serviceable to public causes. Culturally, Diana became a symbol for institutional distrust. Her story is the parable many now use to justify opposing authority. If the palace could betray her, any institution can betray you. That logic has amplified skepticism toward hospitals, corporations, churches, and governments. Skepticism is healthy. Wholesale cynicism is not. The risk is that partial truths, amplified often enough, ossify into totalizing narratives that make constructive reform harder because everything is presumed corrupt. The entertainment industry has been a relentless cleaner and polisher of Diana's myth. Films, shows, and dramatizations habitually select episodes that make for richer drama: betrayal, doomed love, institutional coldness. The constraints of storytelling favor reduction. The Crown and similar works compress decades into tidy arcs. They teach younger audiences an emotionally potent but simplified version of events. This is not an accusation of bad faith so much as an observation about medium and motive. Visual storytelling seeks clarity, which often means erasing complexity. There is also an economic grief market: memorial exhibitions, dress displays, themed tours, and branded merchandise that has monetized mourning. It converts collective sorrow into revenue streams. Mohammed Al-Fayed's campaign and subsequent commerce around the crash are instructive. Grief and suspicion were convertible assets. The more a life is mythologized, the more that mythology yields repeatable products. The result is a feedback loop. Commercial success incentivizes further myth-making, which in turn deepens the public attachment to simplified narratives. On the civic level, Diana's life altered how charities and NGOs solicit support. The personal story model promises empathy and donations. It works, but it also privileges stories that are visually and emotionally marketable. Causes that entail less photogenic complexity struggle for attention. In the long run, that skew restructures philanthropic priorities towards spectacle and away from slow, structural change. Finally, there is the personal legacy: how ordinary people learned to narrate their own pain. The confessional turn in public discourse owes something to Diana. Her willingness to disclose private suffering made it safer, even fashionable, to speak publicly about mental health and trauma. That outcome has saved lives by reducing stigma. Yet it has also normalized a form of public therapeutic labor that can be commodified and weaponized. Once private pain becomes public currency, it can be traded and consumed. If you look up from the plaque and the dress and the statue, you see that Diana's afterlife is architecture. New rituals, new political tactics, new market dynamics, and new social habits of feeling. Some are salutary, destigmatizing, humane, and some are corrosive, commodifying pain, simplifying history. That is the double-edged legacy. The final, uncomfortable observation is this: the story of Diana taught institutions how to perform empathy and taught markets how to sell it. And those lessons continue to shape the world you live in. We began with a princess alone in a dark room and ended with a question that should unsettle any comfortable narrative of history. If a life lived almost entirely in public, documented by thousands, can be so carefully recut, repackaged, and claimed by so many interests within a generation, how many of the truths we accept as history are similarly edited for use? When you learned about heroes in school, when you nodded along to a tidy moral lesson in a film, how often did you absorb a story engineered to make someone feel safer, richer, or more powerful? This inquiry is not an invitation to cynicism, but to curiosity. If you stayed with this investigation to the end, thank you, and if you want more cases opened and more myths untangled, subscribe and add your voice. Tell us where you're watching from, and what story you were taught as a child that now looks different. There are other dossiers waiting. Diana is only one file in a vast archive of stories that shaped our present. Which one should we open next?